Welcome to the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. This is the podcast where we work to unlock the amazing, the epic, the cool, the interesting, the complex, the impactful, the incredible power of storytelling and learn how to harness that power in our everyday lives. I'm Gaurav.
And I'm Kevin. I just caught myself out of breath. But I'm Kevin.
Controlling your breath it's so important. Kev, you and I were having a conversation last week about we were touring apartments. This is our annual tradition. Kevin and I both live alone, but every year, because it's insanely expensive to live in Los Angeles, we tour a bunch of 2 bedrooms and new apartments to see if we can get something significantly cheaper, or we toy with living together again in a 2-bedroom apartment like we did in college. But, and then every year we decide to stay because, newsflash, It's not cheap out there. It's just that expensive. Touring apartments is such a fun experience. I enjoy it because it's like you kind of see how other people live. You see other communities. You see people interacting. You walk into these empty apartments and you just like picture a whole life there. Like you picture a whole story there. You think about going to the pool or walking to that local coffee shop, and you think about new beginnings. And it's kind of fun. I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah. And then you picture that and you think about what you have right now. You become very grateful for the life you're already living. So a satisfying experience, even if it doesn't result in us transitioning.
But I think it can be very eye-opening where it's like, if you can find something you're excited about, if you're more excited about where you live, like that just confirms what you're doing. Like it's this thing about storytelling too, where people get afraid sometimes that if they're presented with a bunch of options, they're going to feel bad about what they're doing, or if they want to do something but they can't find something that's better, they're like, well, I failed. But it's this thing where it's like exposing yourself to diverse stories can either teach you, okay, it's time to change, and there's no shame in that. Like you made decisions best for you, now it's time to change. Or it can be like, I took the time to make myself feel better about where I live now because I took the time to explore what's out there. I took the time to explore the other stories, and I decided, no, this is what's the best fit for me. That's okay too. So why don't we get back to the second part of this episode? On our last episode of Linen Suit and Plastic Tie, we started the conversation with Harvard Business School professor Christina Wallace about living the portfolio life and living a more full, diverse life. And today we continue it on. Today we talk a little bit more about Broadway storytelling and the differences between Broadway and venture investing and some of the similarities. We get a little bit more into her unique, diverse, and interconnecting life, and it's a really interesting conversation.
Let's get back into it. Part 2 with our conversation with Christina Wallace.
Hello, how do you do? Sit down, gather around. We've got stories about stories that'll mix you a drink of wonder and mystique. 'Cause life can be dry, better dressed for the times with the linen suit and plastic tie. Linen suit and plastic tie. Now here's Gaurav and Kevin.
Great segue, speaking of diversification, to our next question for you is, what does it mean for you to be a Broadway producer? Can you speak to that part of your experience?
Of course. I mean, I'm loving the Hadestown t-shirt that Gaurav's rocking right now.
I honestly had I had 4 or 5 different theater shirts this morning, and I was almost like,
clearly I need to send you like a water for elephants or a SUFs or something. So what does it mean to be a Broadway producer? It can mean a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. At the lowest level, it means you are either writing a check or fundraising for usually about $250,000. That's sort of like the entry price point as a co-producer. And you might do that and say like, cool. Let me know if we get a Tony. But then there are lots of other kind of ways that you can contribute. all the way up through being the lead general partnering producer on a show. There are ways that you can get involved from a marketing standpoint and the business side of this, where you might have perspectives on here are places that we should get connected to. Have you thought about this customer segmentation? Like literally putting on my startup customer acquisition hat and digging into the data, which is really fun to get to learn and provide some thoughts there. From an artistic standpoint, where you can go see early rehearsals and get to go to previews and sort of send feedback in, which is often really helpful because when you're in the rehearsal room every day, as the lead producers are, you start to see the same things over and over again. And then you get someone who hasn't been in that room and shows up and sits in a different spot in the theater than you might be sitting. And all of a sudden they see that like this set piece is totally visible from the wings and really distracting. And like, we got to move it more upstage in order to like make sure that it's not hitting the light, so really kind of interesting, fun perspective you can offer there. And then crucially, it's a lot about getting the word out about shows, right? Connecting communities you're in, doing literally like group sales in my Instagram DMs. Like people are like, we've got a group of 25 that want to come see Cabaret. And I'm like, I'm on it. And so, you think that like these big shows have these big budgets and it's still like hitting the pavement, just like a startup, especially in the early days after the show is just launched. And the more, if it's not a revival, if it's an original musical, and it doesn't have a known property behind it, right? Suffs is a truly brand new story, musical. There's no book, there's no film. Like you've got to win over every audience member one by one until there's the groundswell. The word of mouth kind of takes over. And until then, it's like you fight for every sale. And I love it. It's everything that I loved about startups. And it's in a world that just feels like joy to me to be a part of.
I love that. There's so many parallels we see there with venture investing in startups and all the things we usually talk about. I'm obviously a big Broadway person. I'm in New York every few months for work now. I grew up in Toronto, so it's always close. And I do think the Toronto theater scene is very good. I very enjoy the Toronto theater scene, but my parents were big musical and play people, so we grew up watching musicals and plays and loved them so much. And Kevin had never seen anything, never been to a play, never musical until last year. And I took him because it was in town. The first one was Beetlejuice because it was in town. And then we were in New York when were we? October?
Yeah, October, November.
No, October, November. And I took him to see Wicked for the first time during the 10th anniversary. And I've seen it it's my favorite. I think it's the best story ever told. I've seen it many times, and it was just awesome. Incredible as always.
There's something about that moment where Elphaba is flying 40 feet above the stage, belting her face off, and it's ultimately about like feeling like an outsider and trying to find where you belong. Like you can't help but cry your eyes. I love Wicked,
especially when you see it again, where you kind of see the emotion in Glinda's face when she's coming down in that first scene, and you get it because you've seen it, and you're like, oh man, that I almost started crying immediately. So it's such an interesting world, and what I like about these, it's so different than your daily professor world and kind of the tech Silicon Valley world and the New York world. What's it been like kind of living that portfolio life and finding the intersections and dealing with very different personalities? Has there anything you pulled into different things? Has it given you a perspective or a superpower there?
Yeah, it's funny because I started my career in theater and I left it pretty early on, but I always would joke that my 2 years at the Metropolitan Opera, truly the biggest skill I developed there was diva management, which has served me quite well in tech and Silicon Valley, if I'm being honest. So in some ways, it's completely different. The vocabulary, the maybe like ostensibly the values, or, if you're thinking about the trade-offs in something. But in many ways, it's very similar. And I think that is what led me to tech in the first place, and it's what led me back. But what I love in particular for this chapter as a producer is the thesis. I have two producing partners that we work together. They're also from the tech world. We met as entrepreneurs, baby entrepreneurs, in the New York scene in 2011. And we have loved theater together. And so we said we should team up and do this. They went through Y Combinator. They've raised a crap ton of money. And so we had this perspective that there were likely a lot more of us in the tech world who had this love of theater and the performing arts and understand high risk, high return investing, right? I've been an angel investor. I've certainly raised money on that side. We understand what it's like to write 10 checks and 9 of them go to zero and one of them returns the fund, right? That's a form of financial investing that maybe your standard retail index fund investor wouldn't be as comfortable with.
That's Peter Thiel's whole philosophy.
Exactly. So we said this was our thesis. Like, we're going to go out and look for investors like us who don't currently either have access to Broadway or it's just never crossed their mind that this was something they could be part of. And then we're going to create the equivalent of like roll-ups of syndicates for small check investors who want to build a portfolio of bets. They don't want to go all in and write a $50,000 check for some new musical. They want to write 10 $5,000 checks. But you can't write a $5,000 check into a show. No one will take that small of an investment. So we're going to find this crew. We'll bundle them up together in the same way that I do for my angel investments on AngelList. And that's our perspective on how we're going to show up to producing. And the lead producers that we're working with are kind of like, yeah, I don't really understand it. I don't need to understand it. Like, you do you. Tell us when you've got the money. And it has absolutely panned out. You know, in our first season doing this, we co-produced 3 shows and raised over $1 million across, I think, 75 investors for these 3 different musicals. And have like a waiting list out the wazoo of folks saying that it was too late for them to get in on this show, but they're like, let us know about next season. So we're like, oh, okay. Like there's a there. And when I talk to the Broadway people, they're kind of like, what do you mean like fractional and roll up and syndicate? Like these are not concepts that they play in. And at the same time, they're worried about the future of the industry because historically the people who write their checks are these older, white, wealthy people who are getting even older. And they're kind of like, where's the next influx of investors going to come from? I'm like, they're going to come from Silicon Valley. They're going to come from finance, right? They're going to come from these places where like, I did theater in high school. I did orchestra in college. And it's particularly interesting because at this moment, the nonprofit theater world and the nonprofit arts world in general, symphonies, ballets, opera companies are all freaking out because the next generation of philanthropists hasn't shown up. The people who are wealthy now, the tech money, the hedge fund money, this is not generational wealth, where you are trained as you are younger of like, here's your responsibility to society as a wealthy philanthropist. They don't have that training. They get wealthy in their 20s or 30s and suddenly are like, what am I going to do with it? And the practice of philanthropy to these cultural institutions isn't there. But the practice of investing, that is there. And so it's almost like this bright spot in the arts world of like, I don't know if we're going to save the ballet companies and the opera companies, but for-profit Broadway theater, there's an investor base for that. You just got to find them and talk to them a little different.
That is fascinating. That's really interesting because I was going to ask, I was like, how do you get around this scalability aspect? How do you get around the fact that live experience is foreign for a lot of these? I work in tech, I work in entertainment, and it's like, there's a lot of interesting intersections, but how do you get around convincing them these small scale things are going to return a profit? But we see this. We saw this with NFTs even. We saw this with fractional investing. We've seen this with all these alt investment opportunities where people want to invest in stories. People
Yeah.
want to invest in something that they find is cool. It's not just about the index funds, right?
Yeah.
So it's
And
so exciting.
They want to invest in experiences
Yeah.
too. Particularly true for millennial and Gen Z investors. That it's not just let me know when the check comes back. We have folks who write a check and then we have a special investor night. We go on stage after the show. We do a talk back with the artists. We get signed, posters from the cast. We get the inside play-by-play week by week on the box office numbers. It almost feels like, fantasy football for some people are kind of like, ooh, I'm going to update my model and see how we're doing. And while the average show is never going to return the same type of money that I guess Uber does, Hamilton certainly is going to, for those folks that got in. Wicked, damn straight. Phantom of the Opera, Book of Mormon, Hadestown doing gangbusters. There's a big hit every 8 to 10 years that is huge. And more so, there's even a longer tail of shows that even if they don't recoup on Broadway, they don't break even on Broadway, go on to tour. They license their shows to regional theaters, to high schools, and every single one of those derivatives sends royalties back to the original Broadway mother company. So you think it's not scalable because you're thinking about live performance, a fixed number of seats in this theater for 2.5 hours, but the IP has a long tail life. And there actually is opportunity to sort of think about what are all of the derivatives of this IP that original investors get to take advantage of.
Yeah. I mean, some of the stuff that I love that you do, and I hear this a lot in your work, is the use of language. And we talk about this on the show a lot, the use of words and language, the way you use like these finance and these technical and these, it's very deliberate, like portfolio life, like derivatives.
Yes.
To apply to this different world is so fascinating and so important in storytelling.
Yeah. I mean, I learned this and the importance of this actually in like first 2 months of business school. I'd come in with this experience at the Metropolitan Opera. My title there was rehearsal associate, which tells you literally nothing about what I do. And even more so, even if you work in opera, the Met is maybe one of 3 opera companies in the world that are big enough to require an entire rehearsal department. So even within the industry, if I were to go out for jobs at the San Francisco Opera or Detroit Opera, they'd be like, what do you do? So it was already kind of incumbent on me to figure out how to translate what exactly I came with experience doing. But more so, I'm sitting next to these friends in finance, in operations, in manufacturing, and they're like, girl, you could be Big Bird for all we know. Like, we do not understand what you do. And in the moment, I'm trying to go out and make this pivot into entrepreneurship or into other worlds. I have to figure out how to talk about my work using the language of my audience, not the language of my original environment. And that became the big unlock. If I use the terms that I used day in and day out at the Met, 0 people will understand me outside of the Met. So I have to figure out what is the vocabulary, the jargon, and the frameworks of my audience, and how can I translate this? And at the time, I had it hard because I had to sit down with my friends and explain to them what it is I did all day long, and they could feed me the vocabulary. I think anyone now with ChatGPT could literally go in and say, here's what I do in this world. Help me translate this to the stories, the frameworks, the vocabulary of this new industry I'm going into. Because it does 2 things, right? One is it signals to your audience that you understand what they do, what you're signing up for. You understand it enough to put it into their words. And number 2, it just gives them the ability to almost give you full credit for the work you're doing, right? If they have to do the translation, they're going to apply a discount factor. If you say, this is exactly what I've done, they'll be like, oh, I get that. And I know how to value that. And so that becomes a big part of this work. And this is one of the things that Karen Ebert talks about extensively in The Perfect Story is in any story, you have to start with who is your audience? Who is your audience? What do they know? What do they value? And how can you anchor this or scaffold this for them rather than for you?
Yeah, it's something we talk about all the time here. Looking back on the history of the show, that's become one of the most apparent things.
Mm-hmm.
Even in our name, the linen suit and plastic tie, it was about adding a little storytelling to the to the suit and tie aspect to draw you in. And this is a funny story, but when we were starting the show, I designed all the logos and I do most of the little graphic design. It's not great, but it's like, but I was rewatching Smash at the time, and I'm obviously a big Broadway musical person, and so if you look at our logo, even especially if you see some of the older versions, there's a neon tinge to it. It's supposed to be a nod to that kind of neon sign at the beginning of Smash, and also in Broadway. And it's kind of supposed to be adding that little bit of storytelling on top. And I'm like, I gotta tell her this story, because when I heard about the show, got really excited. I'm like, I definitely going to see that. But that's a little bit of our connection to Smash, was that I was literally watching it while designing this logo, and it's supposed to be a nod. It changed as we got to later iterations, but the neon aspect of it, the sign, the reason that the words are in the logo is supposed to be kind of a nod to Smash and nod to musicals.
Well, I love that story. First of all, yay. Smash is going to be amazing, and I can't wait for you to see it. But B, because it also speaks to, and it's no surprise that when I got into the tech world and the entrepreneurship world, that I landed in marketing, customer acquisition, branding, communications, right? It's the storytelling of your business. But one of the things that I'm constantly really emphasizing for my students is that storytelling is not just about your words. You can find ways to show, don't tell, your story through the visuals that you put out in the world, through the things that you are making a nod to, the illusions that you're kind of pointing people to. And again, if you know your audience, you know that like this might not mean anything to that person, but Christina's going to get it, that this is a nod to kind of Broadway and lights and seeing the show light up in Times Square. And so there are ways when you really think through the strategy of a story, whether it's about a job search, whether it's launching a company, whether it's just about like making your home feel like it reflects you. There are the words that you want to say. There's the sort of like, here's the thing I want people to walk away feeling. And then you start thinking about, now, how can I communicate that idea? Is it best done through a visual, a color, a shape, positioning, an artwork, or whatever? And how can I, this is the theater nerd in me back to it. It's like, how can I drop these breadcrumbs of my story throughout whatever my audience is going to experience, so that at the end, they walk away being like, yeah, that's who Christina is. And it wasn't me just reciting for you the list of my attributes or my values. You see it, you experiencing it, and it's consistent across every touch point you have with me.
Amazing.
That's like the dream. It takes effort though.
What are some of the key lessons that you have learned from all the interdisciplinary people that you've gotten to interact with?
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite lessons that it took a while for this to really click for me. It was a phrase literally that we were using at the company I worked with before I joined the faculty. It was called Bionic. And we were a whole bunch of entrepreneurs and investors working with big Fortune 500s to help them build these startup ecosystems inside their organization, right? How do you build like an innovation machine? And so we had these little taglines, these mindsets that we would always repeat. And sometimes it can like launch into like jingoism and you forget the meaning behind it. But one of them was expire your data. And we're like, what does that even mean? But it finally clicked like a year and a half into this. What we're talking about in startup world is if you're relying on insights that are out of date, the world might have changed, the context, the competition, the whatever, that's not serving you. Like past a certain point, expire that data, go get new data to make that decision off of. But as it relates to stories, it finally clicked for me one day around the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and whether there are stories that need to expire because they're no longer true. One of the big ones for me growing up was being told by adults surrounding me that I wasn't athletic. I don't know why or how they decided this. It could be because I run into things a lot. I have bruises. I never know where they come from. And this is true. I'm a little bit of a klutz. But they reiterated this over and over. You're not athletic. And that's okay. You're artistic. You are great at school. You've got other things going for you. You're not athletic. And I just took this as truth. And so I didn't even try. I attempted to run a mile, I think my freshman year of college. I made it once, twice around the track, and I was like, screw this. This is not fun. And I quit. And so in my head, I was like, this is not something I am able to do, right? This is the truth that I know. And it wasn't until my startup failed and I was broke and depressed and just like literally needed a reason to get out of the house in a version of my day that didn't cost me anything. And living in New York, everything costs something. And so I decided to take up running. So I was like, it's free and it requires me to get dressed and get out of the house. That I learned that the key to being good at running is to run. Right? Like you run and then it's easier, and then you can run a little further and then that becomes easier. And you just, if you do it, you get better at it. Shocking. I know. And literally went from couch to marathon in under a year. Like it blew my mind that this thing that I would have sworn on my grandmother's grave was true about me was not. And so it started to make me wonder, what are the other stories that I am accepting as true that might be out of date? And it's almost like excavating, like, how do I know that's true? Like, what are the things I do this sometimes with my students. I'm like, why do you know that about yourself? Like, what is the original story, that moment where you learned this was true? See if you can track back to it. And then ask yourself, is it time to like let that data point expire? Can you get new data on whether that's still true? Or whether turns out you are very athletic. Now at 40 years old, I'm working out 4 times a week. I am so strong. And it empowers so much of the crazy life I live because I've invested so much in my health. That I wouldn't be able to do this if I didn't now have that perspective that like, I am strong, I am an athlete. I still run a 5.5 hour marathon. I'm not fast, but I can do it. Right. And so that's, I think, the big key thing that I stole from startup world. Expire your data. Go in and revalidate if something is still true before you just take it as the truth and move from there.
It's so important. It's absolutely like we talk a lot about getting stuck in our own storylines on this show, and like it is that common joke where a lot of artists are successful because when they were 5, someone told them they were good at it.
Yes,
it's like.
And to be mindful of your precious time, our closing segment is called Suspenders. This is where we ask you a fun, random question that's unrelated to anything whatsoever, and you can give us any answer you feel like.
Marvelous.
Okay, question of the day is, what's a lesson you've learned from your children recently?
I adore my children. They are 2 and 4. And one of the great joys of my 4-year-old, my daughter, is that she is me. She is like Scorpio, very tall, far too smart for her own good, and is just as sensitive to criticism and feedback as I am. She and I both, we bruise like a peach. And it has been fascinating. In some ways, it almost feels like I'm reparenting myself in these moments where I am giving her the language or the skills to breathe through it, to reframe, to whatever, that I'm like, oh, this is not about her. This is actually about me. But in these moments, because she's 4 and no one expects a 4-year-old to be in control of their emotions, it is incredibly reaffirming for me in these bits to be like, okay, maybe this is what I needed it for and I didn't get it. It's fine. How can I learn this lesson myself while I'm also ostensibly teaching her? So I think there's some very humbling moments as a parent, but if you can hear them, you get the opportunity to teach yourself along with your kids the things that maybe you didn't get the first time around.
Welcome back to Top Hat. This is the part of the episode where we dissect and analyze some of the cool, amazing, epic, interesting, and complex lessons we got from this week's expert storyteller. And this week it's a doozy. We're doing a Top Hat for a 2-part episode with Christina Wallace, the Harvard Business School professor who talks about living a portfolio life and investing in different parts of your lives. It was an amazing conversation from truly an amazing educator and person who's really explored the idea of following multi-passions, being multidisciplinary, not having to dedicate your life to one thing, and being quite successful by being the unique version you are of yourself. And she did it through theater and tech, right? She leaned into a uniqueness and pulled from them to have a really interesting career. And I think one of the first really cool lessons that we talked about, and it's something that I've explored a lot, I thought a lot about through my own career journey post-college, because, in college, especially when you're on a visa, you spend so much time thinking about the job you're going to get, what's going to keep you in the country, what are you going to do after you graduate, how are you going to maximize your time here. Tying the identity to your career is so easy and makes so much sense, because if I'm spending so much time doing something, I want to love it. I want it to be a part. I want to be proud of it. And especially when you are getting to do something you love and you're proud of, it's so easy to be like, that's who I am. That's where my power comes from. But your career is just one aspect of your life. And it can be important. It can make you feel powerful. But if you focus too much on it, you're missing out on a lot of other things that can make you happy, that might not be monetarily focused, but could still be and will be super impactful to your life. So this idea of trying to disconnect your identity from your career, especially nowadays while people are spending less time at each company, and trying to figure out who you are versus what you do, is so important. And understanding that that's a conscious effort you have to make.
Yeah. And Christina provided this really interesting perspective or definition on failure, which is the only real failure comes from knowing something isn't right for you and still not do anything about that. And I think it's a great point of reference when it comes to reflecting on our story and our career, to recognize whether or when it's time to make some sort of change.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's hard. It's really hard. It's much easier said than done than saying, if it's not working for you, change it. If the relationship's not working, break up with the person. If the job's not working, quit. If you're not happy, do this, because you're spending so much of your time on this. You want to make it as amazing as you can. You want to make every moment, everything you do as amazing as you can, because time's the only resource you don't get back. And something as important as our careers and our hobbies and our interests, you want to make it as impactful as possible. So it feels very urgent that you're like, oh, this isn't working, gotta quit, gotta move. But sometimes it's about, why isn't this working? Is pivoting the right move, or is there something I can do to make it work? Is putting in the effort, the hard work now gonna make it better? So I think you want to be kind to yourself.
Yeah, and Christina talks about the portfolio life, treating your career and your identity as if you would approach an investment portfolio, and the idea of starting over or getting started on something new and allowing yourself to kind of suck at things speaks to the idea of you can try to add some risk to that portfolio. I definitely agree that it's different with everybody regarding the specific situation you're in. It's not that simple to be like ditch your whole life right now and start something completely different.
That's the key to portfolio life, living a balanced portfolio, is that if you de-risk everything you do, where there's not one thing that's your entire life, it allows you to lose something or pivot or be adaptable. Because if my career is my entire life, I'm less willing to try something new. I'm less willing to take risks because it's so important. But if my career is just one part of my portfolio, even if it's a big part, I'm willing to take time off. I'm willing to try something new. I'm willing to pivot. I'm willing to risk it because I also have my podcast. I also have my friends. I also have all these other stuff that I can pivot to and build on and still feel like I'm living a full life, even if I'm taking a change with my career. It's mostly storytelling. It's like, if I tell the story that I'm just my career is my identity, that's my whole life, I'm not going to take risks with it because I'm terrified. But if I tell my story that I'm a full, complete person, even if my career is taking most of my time, I'm willing to take risks with it and try new things. The story you tell yourself about who you are and what matters to you is so important, and you have to keep questioning it, keep changing it, keep exploring it to become a full person. And that's, I think, the idea of the portfolio life.
It's not about risking it at all. It's about expanding ourselves and explore new opportunities while making the risk manageable relative to where we are in our own life. Otherwise, this has been another great episode of the Linen Suit and Plastic Tie podcast. If you like our content, make sure to subscribe and follow wherever you listen. Leave us a comment and a review to let us know what you're thinking. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at LSPTpod, LinkedIn, Linen Suit and Plastic Tie.
And we'll see you next time.